how story needs to be adapted for interactivity. So, how do we take these fundamentals and adapt them for interactive storytelling? Well, it's not easy. Non-interactive mediums of storytelling, such as novels or film, are passive, although the audience brings their own cultural knowledge, grammar, and biases, forming the lens through which they themselves engage with the work. They are mostly receiving and interpreting. With interactive storytelling, the audience is not only receiving and interpreting, but also inputting. They are making decisions and choices of their own, which can both inform their personal experience and shape the narrative as it evolves. Even if their decisions do not change the narrative directly, the mere act of being presented with an opportunity to participate brings the audience closer to the work itself. Who then gets to choose the paths and outcomes of interactive stories? If a protagonist in a non-interactive medium follows the course plotted out for them, based on their decisions, informed by their characters' wants and needs, and presented via the structure chosen, then in interactive works, do the audience get to make those decisions instead, or at least have input into the nature or extent of them? It's the question at the very heart of any interactive narrative, and will vary depending on your medium, the agency and trust you are willing to hand over to the audience, and the emotional journey you wish them to experience. It raises the question of whether your protagonist becomes a puppet, fully controlled by the audience, or retains a degree of their own agency while being guided by them. Video games usually fall somewhere between these two extremes, with the protagonist either being a puppet controlled by the player, making choices within defined boundaries, or protagonists with their own story arc, which plays out on rails, as it were, with very limited input. In addition, some video games offer a blank slate or customizable avatar that the player can inhabit and immerse themselves directly into the emerging and evolving narrative. What then of the story in terms of developing and creating plot, character, and structure for interactive storytelling? The unhelpful answer is that in many respects it is the same. All of those elements are present, but the nature of them can shift subtly or dramatically depending on the extent of the input granted to the audience. So knowing the foundations of writing for non-interactive stories is essential in tackling interactive ones. But let's start with the plot. There still needs to be a beginning, middle, and end to your interactive storytelling experience. The plot must progress, and the characters and audience must go on a journey. Interactivity, however, means that the plot progression is in the audience's hands. They might be able to control the direction taken, the pace at which it develops, or even the level to which scene or element is engaged with. Scene A might lead to scene C, skipping B entirely, before loitering on D, and then speedily barreling through E, and so on. More agency, more decision over the direction that the plot can take also leads to greater complexity and a branching of the narrative. This is best visualized as a tree, the different decisions being where it branches and splits, and the leaves being all of the possible outcomes or endings that can be reached. Branching narratives give the audience a greater sense of control. They're presented with a decision, and the path they take leads them in a new direction. However, they can only move along the branches that we give them. Control of the pacing, or level of engagement with a story, is more commonly associated with what we can term as a sandbox-style experience. This is where the audience is free to roam, interact and engage with the narrative in an order and pace of their choosing. They might be able to skip over elements completely, or even revisit some multiple times. So how then do we create a coherent narrative experience if the audience can not only decide not to look at what's in the spotlight on the stage, but, in theory, leave their seat or even move it, move or unplug the spotlight even, or ignore it completely and go backstage instead? Well, it all comes down to boundaries, the extent of the interactivity and choices we empower the audience to make. It is utterly dependent on the size of the trees and the sandboxes we allow them to play in. What then of character? How does this need to change for interactive storytelling? Your protagonist will be controlled by the player or audience to some degree. This might be either fully as a puppet or an avatar, or more indirectly as participants or as guides. In the case of puppet protagonists, you need to leave enough room for the player to feel in control, while providing enough context and background that they emotionally buy into the story. Decisions they're presented with need to align with both the character's wants and needs, but also with the player's expectations and own agency, so as not to cause dissonance. You are, after all, asking them to walk in that character's shoes. Avatars are blank slates, either characters created by the player or an extension of themselves. So in theory, there should be no dissonance. But again, if suitable decisions or agency are not available, the experience can be even more jarring, as you're unable to do what you think is best. In contrast, participants and guides trade freedom and agency for a more traditional story experience. Here, the player is a passenger. Their actions move the plot forwards within very rigidly defined boundaries. Devising plot and character for interactive storytelling borrows considerably from its non-interactive counterparts. But where interactivity diverges the most is in structure, and here we'll jump into two of the most common approaches: branching narratives and sandbox experiences. As an exercise, it's worth us taking the time to explore the differences between interactive and non-interactive stories. Firstly, take a story you like and know well, a book or a film, and imagine yourself in the shoes of the main protagonist. Now ask yourself, if you had led exactly the same life as them, what could you have done differently when faced with the same situations and problems? Was there anything that they did that you found frustrating or out of character given their background? Now picture yourself as the protagonist instead, as if you were dropped directly into the story. Does this change anything? Would you make different choices without the context of their character and backstory? Which is more satisfying to you? If you were to write an interactive story, how empty a vessel would you give the player or audience?